You think you are just a good person. You are the peacemaker, the reliable friend, the employee who never causes trouble, and the partner who sacrifices everything for the sake of harmony. But underneath that pleasant, agreeable smile, you are absolutely exhausted. You are burning out from the sheer, invisible effort of constantly managing everyone else's emotional state. Being the nice guy or the sweet girl isn't the moral high ground you have been taught to believe it is. In reality, it is a psychological cage that is actively destroying your mental health and poisoning your most intimate relationships. We live in a society that aggressively rewards compliance and labels it as goodness. But if your goodness is driven by a deep, underlying fear of conflict or rejection, it isn't goodness at all. It is a defense mechanism. To truly cure chronic people-pleasing, we have to strip away the romanticized view of self-sacrifice and look at the uncomfortable psychological reality beneath. In the realm of modern trauma psychology, chronic people-pleasing is recognized as the fawn response. Just like the primal instincts of fight, flight, or freeze, fawning is a survival mechanism hardwired into your nervous system. You likely learned at a very young age that the safest way to exist in an unpredictable or emotionally volatile environment was to completely abandon your own needs. You became a chameleon, molding yourself to the desires and moods of others to neutralize perceived threats. If you could just be perfect, helpful, and invisible, you would be safe from anger, criticism, or abandonment. But what served as a brilliant survival strategy in childhood becomes a suffocating prison in adulthood. You are no longer a helpless child, yet your nervous system is still operating as if a single no will result in your total destruction. This leads us to a truth that might sting to hear. Chronic people-pleasing is actually an unconscious form of manipulation. When you constantly bend over backwards to accommodate others, you are secretly trying to control how they perceive you. You are engineering a highly curated, non-threatening version of yourself to guarantee attachment and avoid the terrifying prospect of rejection. You say yes, not out of genuine generosity, but to buy emotional safety. You are essentially offering a covert contract to the world that says, I will sacrifice my authenticity, and in exchange, you must never abandon me. The ultimate tragedy of this unspoken contract is that it guarantees you will never feel truly loved. Even when people praise you, validate you, and keep you around, a quiet, nagging voice in the back of your mind knows the truth. They do not love you. They love the mask you wear, and they love the convenience you provide. To break out of this exhausting cycle, we have to look outside of superficial self-help cliches. We need a map of the human mind that goes deep enough to uproot the core of this behavior. Enter Carl Jung, the legendary Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst. Unlike many of his contemporaries who viewed the mind simply as a biological machine to be fixed, Jung saw the human psyche as a vast, largely uncharted ocean. He believed that our conscious mind, the part of you listening to this video right now, the part that thinks it is in control, is just a tiny island. This island rests on top of a massive, hidden, underwater continent called the unconscious. Jung theorized that the psyche is a dynamic, self-regulating system that is always striving for balance. When you consciously push a behavior, a desire, or a feeling away because it doesn't fit your nice persona, it doesn't simply vanish. It sinks into those unconscious depths. For the chronic people-pleaser, this means every no you swallowed, every boundary you failed to set, and every ounce of justified anger you suppressed is still living inside of you. Jung warned that whatever we refuse to face within ourselves will eventually meet us in the external world as our destiny. Your compulsion to please is the manifestation of a deeply unbalanced psyche, one that has severed ties with its own vital energy in exchange for cheap approval. According to Jung, the ultimate goal of human life is not happiness, wealth, or even societal harmony. The true goal of life is a profound process he called individuation. Individuation is the arduous, lifelong psychological journey of becoming a whole, indivisible self. It is the process of gathering all the scattered, rejected, and hidden pieces of your psyche and bringing them into the light of consciousness. To individuate means to strip away the expectations of your parents, your culture, and your peers until you uncover the irreducible core of who you truly are. Imagine your psyche as a beautiful, ancient mirror that was shattered into 100 pieces during your childhood. The chronic people-pleaser has picked up one tiny, shiny, agreeable shard, holding it up to the world while desperately kicking the other 99 jagged pieces under the rug. Individuation is the painful, necessary process of crawling on your hands and knees to retrieve those broken shards. It involves picking up the sharp edges of your anger, your selfishness, and your boundaries and painstakingly gluing them back together. It might cut your hands in the process, but it is the only way to ever see your true reflection. Here is the brutal, unavoidable truth. You cannot individuate while being a chronic people-pleaser. The two paths are fundamentally, completely incompatible. People-pleasing requires you to remain fragmented. It demands that you cut off your darker instincts, your preferences, and your power, tossing them into the basement of your mind so you can present a perfectly smooth surface to the world. As long as your primary goal is to keep everyone else comfortable, you will remain a psychological infant, eternally dependent on external validation to dictate your self-worth. Individuation demands that you stop being nice and start being whole. Wholeness is not always pretty, and it is rarely convenient for the people around you. A whole person has teeth, and while they can be deeply compassionate, they are also fiercely protective of their own energy. When you begin the journey of individuation, you stop asking the world, "Who do you need me to be?" And you start asking yourself, "Who am I when I am no longer afraid?" This is not a journey for the faint of heart, but it is the absolute only path to genuine freedom. Before we can dive into the specifics of your psychological mask and the shadowy depths beneath it, we need to establish a baseline of your current reality. You cannot fix a pattern you refuse to clearly see. Your homework for this first step of the journey is simple in theory, but incredibly confronting in practice. I want you to track just one single day of your life, keeping a note on your phone or carrying a small piece of paper in your pocket. For the next 24 hours, I want you to write down every single time you say yes, when every fiber of your being actually wants to say no. Write down every time you apologize when you did nothing wrong, and note every moment you laugh at a joke just to ease the tension. Do not try to change the behavior yet. Just observe it and document it. You are going to realize exactly how much of your daily energy is being drained by this invisible compulsion. And that raw realization is the first spark of your individuation. Once you look at that notepad and see the sheer volume of forced smiles, fake agreements, and swallowed objections, you're staring directly at what Carl Jung called the persona. Derived from the Latin word for the theatrical masks worn by actors in ancient Rome, the persona is the carefully curated face you present to the external world. Jung did not view the persona as inherently evil or malicious. In fact, he believed it was absolutely vital for the functioning of a civilized society. We all need a professional mask for the workplace, a polite mask for interactions with strangers, and an agreeable mask for casual acquaintances. It is the necessary social lubricant that prevents everyday life from devolving into constant, chaotic conflict. The danger arises not from wearing a mask, but from entirely forgetting that you are wearing one. For the chronic people-pleaser, this social tool has ceased to be a temporary garment and has become permanently fused to the skin. You no longer know where the accommodating character ends and your actual soul begins. You have so heavily over-identified with your role as the helper, the peacemaker, or the good listener that you believe this is the totality of your identity. When someone asks you what you want for dinner, what movie you want to watch, or what your actual opinion is, your mind goes completely blank. The mask has eaten the face beneath it. To understand why this psychological fusion occurred, we have to trace the persona back to its origins in your earliest environment. The people-pleasing mask almost always begins as the good child archetype, forged in the fires of early childhood conditioning. In a healthy, emotionally secure family dynamic, a child learns that love is a baseline guarantee. They are allowed to be messy, defiant, frustrated, and loud without the terrifying threat of losing their caregiver's affection. They learn that they can displease their parents and still be entirely worthy of love, attention, and safety. But if you grew up in a home where affection was treated as a conditional currency, the rules of survival were drastically different. You quickly learned that love, attention, and safety were rewarded exclusively for compliance, silence, and high achievement. Conversely, any display of negative emotion, boundary setting, or resistance was met with withdrawal, explosive anger, or deep, guilt-inducing disappointment. Your developing brain internalized a devastating lesson. Your authentic self is dangerous, and expressing it will get you abandoned. To survive, you began to carefully observe the adults around you, constantly scanning their moods and adjusting your behavior to ensure their comfort. You became an emotional contortionist, relentlessly pruning away all the vibrant, difficult, and demanding parts of your developing personality. Imagine a child taking a pair of heavy shears to a wild, blossoming oak tree, hacking away at its natural growth to force it into the shape of a tiny, uniform bark's hedge. You morphed into the surrogate therapist for a depressed parent, the invisible ghost in a volatile household, or the flawless overachiever who never caused a single problem. You built a persona constructed entirely out of what other people needed you to be, and in the process, you abandoned the core of who you actually were. Fast forward to adulthood, and the maintenance of this flawless, endlessly accommodating persona demands an astronomical amount of psychological and physical energy. Imagine walking around with a heavy iron shield strapped to your arm every single second of the day. Eventually, your muscles will begin to tear from the strain. This is the psychic toll of constantly suppressing your true desires, swallowing your objections, and biting your tongue to keep the peace. You are not actually laid back, and you are not endlessly flexible. You are simply absorbing the friction of every single relationship you have and internalizing it directly into your own body. This internalized friction does not magically evaporate just because you refuse to express it externally. It ferments into a deep, unspoken resentment that simmers just below the surface of your conscious mind. You begin to secretly despise the very people you are bending over backwards to accommodate, feeling profoundly unappreciated for sacrifices they never even asked you to make. The exhaustion you feel at the end of the day isn't just physical tiredness. It is the profound, soul-crushing fatigue of acting in a theatrical play 24 hours a day. You are living in a state of chronic self-betrayal, and your psyche is keeping a meticulous score. Modern psychology and somatic research increasingly point to a terrifying correlation between this chronic emotional suppression and severe physical consequences. The relentless stress of maintaining the nice persona keeps the nervous system locked in a low-grade, constant state of fight or flight. You are perpetually hypervigilant, scanning the room to ensure no one is upset with you and bracing for imagined conflicts. Over time, this chronic stress response can manifest as debilitating fatigue, unexplained chronic pain, tension headaches, and severe digestive issues. There is even growing research linking chronic people-pleasing to autoimmune disorders, as the body literally turns on itself under the crushing weight of the unexpressed self. The cruelest irony of the people-pleasing persona is that it actively sabotages the very thing it was designed to achieve. You wear this mask because you believe it makes you lovable, indispensable, and highly respected by your peers. Yet, the exact opposite is true. Being a perfect people-pleaser inevitably makes people respect you less and trust you less. Human beings are highly attuned to authenticity on a primal, evolutionary level. Our nervous systems are incredibly skilled at detecting when someone's outward behavior does not match their internal emotional state. When you constantly agree with everyone, never voice a dissenting opinion, and aggressively over-accommodate, people subconsciously sense that something is fundamentally off. They feel the distinct lack of a solid, genuine core beneath your pleasantries and forced smiles. This creates the paradox of likability that traps so many chronic fawners. Because you stand for nothing and refuse to hold a firm boundary, others cannot trust the validity of your agreements or the sincerity of your compliments. If you say yes to absolutely everything, your yes becomes entirely meaningless. People may keep you around because your lack of boundaries makes you highly convenient, but they do not deeply trust you. They view you as an emotional utility, a reliable tool to be used when they need a favor, rather than a valued, equal partner in a relationship. True respect requires friction. It requires two distinct individuals who are willing to assert their own needs and negotiate the space between them. By refusing to ever introduce friction, you erase yourself from the equation entirely. You become a hollow mirror, reflecting everyone else's desires back at them, completely devoid of your own reflection. To begin dismantling this prison, you must first define the specific shape of the bars that hold you. The persona is not identical for everyone. It takes on distinct flavors depending on your specific childhood conditioning and survival needs. Your homework for this stage of the journey is to identify the three core traits of your specific mask. Are you the peacemaker, who immediately diffuses tension with humor? Are you the fixer who compulsively solves other people's problems to feel valuable? Or are you the martyr who silently suffers and overworks to prove your dedication? Name the roles you play, write them down, and recognize them for what they are. Characters in an exhausting script you no longer have to read. Once you have identified the specific mask you wear, a terrifying but necessary question emerges. Where did all the other pieces of your personality go? When you spent your childhood meticulously building the peacemaker or the martyr, you didn't just magically erase your natural human capacity for anger, selfishness, or defiance. The human psyche does not have a delete button, and everything that did not fit into your pristine, acceptable persona had to be put somewhere. In Jungian psychology, this dark dumping ground for the repressed, unacknowledged, and unacceptable parts of the self is known as the shadow. The shadow is the dark twin of your conscious identity, containing every impulse, desire, and emotion that your family or culture deemed inappropriate. For a child desperate to secure love through compliance, the shadow becomes a massive, locked basement where vital parts of the self are violently shoved into the dark. You threw away your capacity to disagree, your natural territorial instincts, and your right to prioritize your own comfort. But those discarded fragments did not die in the dark. They simply mutated under the immense pressure of your denial. To understand the exact shape of your personal shadow, you have to understand Jung's rule of opposites. The psyche operates on a system of polarity, meaning that every conscious extreme automatically generates an equal and opposite unconscious extreme. As Jung famously observed, the brighter the light, the darker the shadow. If you spend your entire life consciously striving to be perfectly selfless, accommodating, and pure, you are inadvertently building a shadow that is deeply selfish, rigid, and profane. You cannot construct an exaggerated persona of absolute goodness without simultaneously creating a monster in the basement. So, what exactly lies in the dark for a chronic people-pleaser? It is everything you are utterly terrified of being accused of. Deep within your unconscious mind lives a fiercely narcissistic entity that desperately wants to be the center of attention and demands to be served. There is a reservoir of raw, unadulterated anger that is furious about being constantly overlooked, minimized, and taken advantage of. There is a deeply selfish part of you that does not care about anyone else's feelings, struggles, or expectations. Alongside that selfishness lives your repressed capacity for aggression and power. Your shadow holds the primal, unapologetic energy required to look someone dead in the eye and deliver a brutal, unyielding no. It contains your raw sexual desires, your ambition, and your capacity to be ruthless when your boundaries are threatened. Because your persona is built on being utterly harmless, your shadow contains all of your psychological teeth. It is the inner beast that knows exactly how to bite, how to defend its territory, and how to demand immediate respect. You might believe that because you have successfully locked these traits away, you are in complete control of them. You tell yourself that you are simply a good person who doesn't possess these dark, messy, and destructive impulses. But Jungian psychology warns that the shadow is not a passive storage unit. It is a living, breathing, highly pressurized system. The more you starve your shadow of conscious acknowledgement, the more dense and autonomous it becomes. It begins to operate like a second, hidden personality that is entirely outside of your conscious control. A starved shadow will always find a way to eat, And because you refuse to integrate your darker traits consciously, they will inevitably leak out in highly destructive ways. This is why chronic people-pleasers are so utterly prone to passive aggression. You cannot bring yourself to express direct, healthy anger, so your shadow orchestrates subtle, deniable acts of sabotage. You accidentally forget to do a favor you promised. You give backhanded compliments, or you respond to a loved one with a heavily sighing, martyred silence. When the pressure in the unconscious basement becomes too great, the shadow doesn't just leak, it violently detonates. This is the phenomenon of the nice guy, or sweet girl, who suddenly flies into a terrifying, disproportionate rage over a minor inconvenience like a dropped glass or a traffic jam. The persona briefly cracks under the immense strain, and decades of repressed fury come pouring out in a single, terrifying outburst. Afterwards, the conscious ego is horrified, frantically apologizing and claiming, "I don't know what came over me. That wasn't me." But it was you. It was just the part of you that you vehemently refused to claim. The unacknowledged shadow also wreaks havoc through covert self-sabotage and secret compulsions. Because your waking life is rigidly controlled by the exhausting demands of others, your shadow seeks rebellion in the dark. This often manifests as binge eating, secret addictions, reckless financial spending, or abruptly ghosting relationships without explanation. These destructive behaviors are the shadow's desperate attempt to assert autonomy and reclaim some form of power. It is the unconscious mind screaming, "If I cannot be free in the light, I will riot in the dark." The ultimate tragedy of this dynamic is that you actually need the contents of your shadow to survive in the real world. By locking away your aggression, your selfishness, and your capacity to cause discomfort, you have entirely disarmed yourself. You have voluntarily handed over your weapons in a world that absolutely requires you to defend your territory. You cannot establish a healthy boundary without accessing the aggressive energy stored in your shadow. You cannot prioritize your own mental health without tapping into the healthy selfishness you have condemned as evil. Meeting your shadow self is not about becoming a villain or abandoning your moral compass. It is about acknowledging the full, unfiltered spectrum of your humanity. You must realize that the capacity for badness exists within you, and that this very capacity is what gives your goodness any actual value. A person who is incapable of causing harm is not virtuous. They are simply harmless. True morality is having the teeth to bite, the power to destroy, and the conscious discipline to keep those weapons sheathed until they are absolutely necessary. To stop the shadow from controlling your life from behind the scenes, you must bravely invite it up into the conscious light. You have to look at the monster you have created and say, "I see you, and I acknowledge that you are a part of me." This is the terrifying threshold of shadow work, and it requires a level of brutal honesty that the people-pleasing persona is perfectly designed to avoid. You must stop looking away from your own darkness. Your homework for this stage of individuation is to use the world around you as a mirror to see your own hidden depths. I want you to open your journal and answer one deeply uncomfortable prompt. What is the one personality trait I judge most harshly in other people? Think of the person who irritates you the most, the behavior that makes your blood boil, or the trait you constantly criticize. Write it down in detail, and then prepare yourself for the hardest pill you will ever have to swallow. Whatever you just wrote down is the exact trait that lives at the very center of your own unacknowledged shadow. If that last realization made your stomach drop, you are experiencing the psychological defense mechanism known as projection. When the ego cannot tolerate a specific trait within itself, it forcefully ejects that trait and pastes it onto the people around you. Think of your unconscious mind as a high-powered movie projector and the people in your life as the blank silver screens. You are not actually reacting to who they objectively are. You are reacting to the disowned parts of your own psyche that you have painted over them. The traits that trigger you the most in others are almost always the exact traits you have strictly forbidden yourself from expressing. This is why the chronic people-pleaser is so acutely sensitive to selfishness, arrogance, and entitlement in their social circle. You have spent your entire life starving your own capacity to take up space, So watching someone else do it freely feels like a psychological assault. Your intense irritation is not actually rooted in a superior moral code, despite what your carefully crafted ego tells you. It is rooted in deep, unconscious envy. A part of your shadow is screaming from the basement, furious that this other person is allowed to act on the exact impulses you have locked away in the dark. This mechanism of projection does not just dictate who annoys you, it entirely dictates who you attract into your life. Have you ever wondered why you, as a deeply empathetic, giving, and accommodating person, constantly find yourself entangled with narcissists, energy vampires, and chronic boundary crossers? It is not a coincidence, and it is not simply because you have a big heart that bad people want to exploit. In the Jungian framework, the psyche is always desperately trying to achieve wholeness, even if it has to do so through highly dysfunctional means. If you refuse to embody your own shadow, your unconscious mind will literally go out into the world and find someone to embody it for you. You and the toxic person are two halves of the same fractured psychological system. You operate like two opposite poles of a powerful magnet, drawn together by a mutual unconscious need to complete the circuit. The narcissist, or the boundary crosser, lacks the capacity for empathy, self-reflection, and accommodation, the exact traits you have overdeveloped in your persona. Conversely, you lack the capacity for assertion, entitlement, and unapologetic self-interest, the exact traits they possess in abundance. Together, you form a perfectly locked, highly destructive psychological ecosystem. When you enter into a relationship with someone who constantly bulldozes boundaries, you are engaging in a process called subcontracting your shadow. Because your nice persona forbids you from ever being demanding, aggressive, or overtly selfish, you unconsciously partner with someone who will act out these forbidden energies on your behalf. You get to stand adjacent to their power and entitlement without ever having to take the terrifying risk of claiming it for yourself. It is a covert arrangement where they get to consume your endless emotional labor, and you get to vicariously experience their unapologetic audacity. Watch how a chronic people-pleaser behaves when their highly aggressive or entitled partner confronts a waiter, yells at a customer service rep, or dominates a social gathering. The people-pleaser will consciously act embarrassed, apologizing for their partner's behavior and playing the role of the mortified peacemaker. But on a deeper, unconscious level, a part of their shadow is quietly thrilled by the confrontation. The partner is effectively expressing all the repressed rage and dominance the people-pleaser is entirely too terrified to unleash. You are using the toxic person as an emotional hitman to execute the dirty work your pristine persona refuses to touch. This dynamic breeds a highly toxic, secondary psychological benefit, the illusion of moral superiority. As long as you are the victim of a selfish, demanding partner or friend, you get to maintain your identity as the immaculate, suffering saint. The worse they behave, the better you get to feel about your own endless patience and self-sacrifice. You build a comfortable, padded cell out of your own martyrdom. You tell yourself, I am the good one, the giving one, the one who bears the cross, while secretly relying on their bad behavior to justify your entire narrative. This resentment trap is incredibly addictive because it entirely absolves you of personal responsibility. As long as the toxic person is the designated villain of your life story, you never have to face the terrifying prospect of your own autonomy. You can blame your lack of progress, your exhaustion, and your unhappiness entirely on their unreasonable demands. But the harsh Jungian truth is that you are not a hostage in this dynamic. You are a willing participant. Your refusal to integrate your own shadow is the glue that keeps you stuck to this person. To break this magnetic pull, you have to radically shift how you view the difficult people in your life. They are not simply monsters sent to ruin your peace. They are dark mirrors reflecting your own unlived potential. The boundary crosser is showing you your own repressed need to take up space and demand respect. The selfish friend is demonstrating your own starved desire to prioritize your own needs without guilt. Until you can reclaim these traits and integrate them into your own conscious personality, you will continue to attract these people like moths to a flame. Your unconscious mind will relentlessly repeat this lesson until you finally learn it. If you leave one toxic relationship without integrating the shadow traits it represented, you will simply walk into an identical dynamic with a person wearing a different face. You cannot outrun your own shadow by cutting off external relationships or moving to a new city. The only way to stop attracting people who exploit your lack of boundaries is to become a person who actually possesses boundaries. And you cannot build boundaries out of pure, accommodating sweetness. You must build them out of the very aggression and selfishness you have been projecting onto others. This brings us to the next vital step of your individuation journey. Your homework for this chapter requires you to look directly at the most difficult, draining relationship currently active in your life. I want you to isolate the specific trait this person exhibits that drives you absolutely crazy, whether it is their arrogance, their laziness, their entitlement, or their refusal to compromise. Now ask yourself this deeply uncomfortable question. Where in my own life do I desperately need to employ a healthy dose of that exact trait? What would happen if I allowed myself to be just 10% as selfish as they are? Answering that question, what happens if you become 10% more selfish, feels like stepping off a cliff. For the chronic people pleaser, intentionally adopting the traits you have spent a lifetime despising triggers a profound, visceral panic. Your ego has constructed its entire survival strategy around being the harmless, accommodating saint. To willingly walk into the basement of your psyche and admit, I am also the monster, feels like an act of psychological suicide. But this terrifying descent into the underworld is the absolute only way to retrieve the power you abandoned. Your conscious mind will fight this descent with everything it has. It will throw up walls of intense shame, sudden exhaustion, or a barrage of rationalizations, explaining why you simply do not have time for this deep introspection. The ego is terrified that if you let the monster out of the basement, it will completely take over and destroy your carefully curated life. It assumes that acknowledging your inner darkness is the exact same thing as acting it out destructively in the real world. You must realize that observing your shadow is not the same as surrendering to it. Survive this descent without being consumed by self-hatred, you must cultivate the perspective of the neutral observer. This is a state of mind rooted entirely in clinical curiosity rather than moral judgment. When a dark, selfish, or aggressive impulse rises to the surface, your immediate reflex as a people pleaser is to violently shove it back down and punish yourself for feeling it. The neutral observer simply watches the impulse float by, saying, how fascinating that this lives inside of me. You must strip the heavy moral weight off your repressed emotions before you can safely examine them. Shame is the lock on the basement door, and as long as you are judging your shadow, it will refuse to speak to you honestly. Think of your shadow not as a demonic entity, but as a feral, terrified animal that has been trapped in the dark for decades. If you approach it with a stick, ready to beat it into submission, it will only bite you or retreat further into the shadows. You must sit quietly at the edge of the dark, offering a calm, non-judgmental presence until that feral part of you feels safe enough to step into the light. If you are struggling to see your shadow in your waking life, you must look to where your conscious defenses are entirely down. When you fall asleep, the rigid, accommodating persona is temporarily deactivated, leaving the basement door wide open. Carl Jung believed that dreams were the most direct, unfiltered language of the unconscious mind. Your shadow frequently communicates through recurring nightmares, particularly those where you are being chased, attacked, or paralyzed. The terrifying figure pursuing you in your dreams is rarely an external threat. It is almost always a disowned part of your own psyche begging for your attention. The shadow also slips notes under the door during your waking hours in the form of intrusive thoughts. Have you ever been sitting in a perfectly polite, boring meeting and suddenly had a vivid, unprompted flash of screaming at your boss or flipping the table? For a people pleaser, these sudden spikes of aggressive or taboo imagery trigger immediate, paralyzing guilt. You frantically try to scrub your mind clean, convinced that having a dark thought makes you a fundamentally bad person. But these intrusive flashes are simply the shadow knocking on the floorboards, reminding you that your repressed aggression is still highly active. Instead of running from these nocturnal monsters or daylight intrusions, the neutral observer turns around and faces them. The next time you wake up from a stressful dream where you are acting wildly out of character, do not immediately try to forget it. Write down the emotions you felt in the dream. Were you violently angry, profoundly selfish, or acting completely out of control? Your unconscious is actively staging a theatrical play to show you exactly which emotional energies are starving for integration. By decoding these symbols, you are learning the unique, private language of your own hidden depths. Observing the shadow through dreams and passing thoughts is the preparation phase, but eventually you must initiate direct contact. To do this, Jung developed a powerful, highly advanced psychological tool called active imagination. This is not passive daydreaming or simple meditation. It is a deliberate, waking dialogue with the unconscious mind. Active imagination requires you to intentionally lower the barrier between your conscious ego and your shadow, allowing them to finally speak face to face. It is the psychological equivalent of walking down the basement stairs and pulling up a chair. To communicate with an abstract concept like the shadow, you must first give it a tangible form. Close your eyes and ask your repressed anger, your hidden selfishness, or your forbidden aggression to take the shape of a person or a creature. Do not force an image. Simply wait in the dark until a figure spontaneously materializes in your mind's eye. It might look like a hardened warrior, a wounded beast, a cynical villain, or even a younger, furious version of yourself. By personifying this energy, you detach it from your core identity, making it possible to hold an objective conversation. Once the figure is clear in your mind, you must ask it a direct question, and most importantly, you must listen to the answer without interrupting. Ask this shadowy figure, "Why are you so angry?" Or, "What are you trying to protect me from?" Then, step out of the way and let the image speak back to you. The response will not feel like something you are consciously inventing. It will often surprise you with its bluntness, its profanity, or its raw sorrow. This is the authentic voice of your unlived life, finally being given the microphone it has been denied. As you engage in this dialogue, you will discover a shocking truth about the monster in the basement. It is not trying to destroy you. It is furiously trying to save you from your own chronic self-betrayal. Your shadow holds the primal wisdom that your accommodating persona completely lacks. It knows exactly who is taking advantage of you. It knows exactly where your boundaries are being violated, and it refuses to pretend everything is fine. When you actually listen to your shadow, you realize that its terrifying rage is just fiercely protective love that has been locked in the dark. Moving from theory to practice requires you to create a physical bridge between the conscious and unconscious worlds. Your homework for this stage of the descent is to try a 10-minute active imagination exercise using a pen and paper. I want you to sit in a quiet room, grab your journal, and write a letter addressed directly to your repressed anger. Acknowledge how long you have ignored it, apologize for locking it away, and ask it what it needs you to know right now. Now comes the crucial, transformative step. You must let your anger right back. Switch your pen to your non-dominant hand, or simply drop your conscious filter entirely and allow that dark, frustrated energy to dictate the response. Do not edit the words, do not police the grammar, and absolutely do not judge the content. Let the shadow spit, swear, and scream onto the page until it has nothing left to say. This raw, unfiltered dialogue is the exact moment you stop being a fragmented people-pleaser and take your first real step into the underworld. Once you read that letter from your shadow, you will likely feel a mix of profound relief and utter terror. You have finally opened the basement door and looked your inner monster directly in the eye. But Jungian psychology teaches us that simply acknowledging the shadow is not enough to cure chronic people-pleasing. You cannot just visit the monster on weekends. You must invite it upstairs to live with you in the light. This is the crux of the integration phase, where you stop observing your dark traits and begin actively wielding them. Carl Jung famously stated that the shadow is 90% pure gold. When you locked away your anger, your defiance, and your selfishness, you didn't just banish your capacity for destruction. You banished your vital life force, your raw creativity, and your fundamental personal power. The people-pleasing persona is chronically exhausted precisely because it is operating without this golden fuel. To become a whole, individuated human being, you must reclaim this stolen energy and put it to work for your conscious mind. The first and most terrifying piece of gold you must retrieve is your capacity for aggression. In our modern, highly sanitized culture, we have conflated all aggression with malicious violence and cruelty. But in the realm of biology and psychology, healthy aggression is simply the energetic force required to move forward and protect what is yours. It is the primal, unapologetic energy of a mother bear fiercely defending her cubs from a wandering predator. Without access to this biological force, you are completely defenseless against a world that will happily consume your time and energy. People-pleasers mistakenly believe they can set boundaries using only their intellect and their polite vocabulary. They read self-help books, memorize gentle scripts, and try to politely negotiate for their basic human needs. But a boundary without the underlying energy of aggression is just a suggestion, and chronic boundary crossers will step right over it. True psychological boundaries require teeth. You must possess the internal, aggressive capacity to say, "This is my territory, and if you cross this line, there will be consequences." To wield this protective aggression, you must radically redefine a word that has terrorized you since childhood: selfishness. For the chronic fauna, being called selfish is the ultimate psychological death sentence. You have built your entire identity on being endlessly accommodating, sacrificing your own needs to ensure everyone else's comfort. But this pathological selflessness is exactly what is draining your life force and breeding deep, toxic resentment. It is time to realize that healthy selfishness is not a moral failing. It is the fundamental law of self-preservation. You cannot pour from an empty cup, yet the people-pleaser is constantly scraping the dry bottom of their own soul to hydrate others. Reclaiming your inner monster means unapologetically prioritizing your own physical, emotional, and energetic reserves. It means recognizing that your time, your money, and your peace of mind belong to you first. When you finally embrace your right to be selfish, you stop viewing your own needs as an inconvenience to the world. You begin to treat yourself with the fierce, uncompromising loyalty that you have always freely given to everyone else. Understanding this conceptually is only half the battle. The real work happens deep within your nervous system. The people-pleaser treats boundaries as a mental exercise, but a true boundary is a deeply physical, somatic event. When you are asked to do something you do not want to do, your body knows the answer before your brain even processes the question. Your stomach tightens, your chest restricts, and a silent, internal no echoes through your physiology. The tragedy of the fawn response is that you have trained yourself to actively override this biological alarm system. To integrate your shadow, you must move the concept of boundary setting out of your head and into your body. This is what modern psychology calls the embodied no. It is the practice of aligning your vocal cords with the physical, undeniable truth of your nervous system. When you deliver an embodied no, you do not shrink, you do not raise the pitch of your voice, and you do not frantically search the other person's face for approval. You ground your feet, tap into that reclaimed aggressive energy, and let the refusal drop from your chest like a heavy stone. The most critical component of the embodied no is the total elimination of the justification reflex. When a people-pleaser finally manages to decline a request, they almost always bury the refusal under a mountain of apologies and elaborate excuses. You invent scheduling conflicts, exaggerate your workload, or fake an illness just to soften the blow of your noncompliance. But every time you offer an unprompted excuse, you are subconsciously signaling that your raw preference is not a valid enough reason to decline. You are handing the other person a puzzle to solve, inviting them to troubleshoot your excuse until you are forced to say yes. An integrated person understands that no is a complete sentence. You do not owe the world a detailed presentation explaining why you are choosing to protect your own energy. When you stop apologizing for your boundaries, you stop acting like you have committed a crime. This requires you to tolerate the excruciating silence that follows a direct refusal, resisting the agonizing urge to fill the dead air with a nervous ramble. You must let your no stand on its own 2 feet, anchored by the quiet, terrifying power of your newly integrated shadow. Think of this integration process like a master blacksmith forging a heavy sword in a roaring fire. The raw iron of your shadow, your anger, your selfishness, and your aggression is heated, hammered, and folded into something incredibly strong. You are not creating a weapon to indiscriminately attack the people around you or cause unnecessary harm. You are forging a sword of discernment, a tool designed to cut away the demands, expectations, and manipulations that do not serve your highest good. You keep this sword sheathed in your daily life, but everyone around you can instantly sense that you are armed. This is why integrating the shadow cures chronic people-pleasing at the root level. When you possess your own aggression, your entire energetic signature completely changes. You no longer walk into a room broadcasting the desperate, highly exploitable energy of a harmless prey animal. You project the quiet, unshakable confidence of a creature that knows exactly how to defend itself, naturally repelling those who seek to exploit you. To anchor this immense psychological shift into reality, you must take immediate physical action. Your homework for this phase of the journey is to find one minor, low-stakes opportunity this week to exercise your embodied no. When a coworker asks you to take on a small task, or an acquaintance invites you to a casual event you do not want to attend, you are going to decline. You will look them in the eye, say, "No, I won't be able to do that," and then you will completely shut your mouth. You will not offer a single excuse. You will not apologize for the inconvenience, and you will let the uncomfortable silence forge your new psychological armor. When you drop that unadorned, unapologetic no into the conversation, the silence that follows will feel deafening. You have just violated the unspoken contract that governed your entire social existence. The people around you, accustomed to your endless compliance, will experience a profound psychological shock. They have relied on you to be the emotional shock absorber of their lives, and suddenly the machinery is broken. This is the exact moment the theoretical work of individuation collides with the messy, unforgiving reality of your interpersonal relationships. Do not expect a standing ovation for your newfound psychological health. The immediate reaction from your social circle will rarely be pride or understanding. It will almost always be resistance. You will hear phrases designed to induce immediate shame. "You've changed. You're being incredibly selfish lately." Or, "You used to be so nice." These accusations are not objective assessments of your character. They are desperate attempts to pull you back into your designated box. Your growth is highly inconvenient for people who have historically benefited from your lack of boundaries. In behavioral psychology, there is a phenomenon known as an extinction burst. When a deeply ingrained behavior is suddenly no longer rewarded, the organism doesn't just quietly give up. Instead, it temporarily escalates the behavior, trying even harder to get the expected result before finally abandoning the strategy. When you stop rewarding manipulation, guilt trips, and demanding behavior with your usual appeasement, the toxic elements in your life will double down. They will throw emotional tantrums, play the victim, or launch smear campaigns to force your compliance. This escalation is the crucible where your newly forged sword of discernment will be tested. A parent might suddenly develop a mysterious health crisis the moment you refuse to attend a holiday dinner. A friend might accuse you of abandoning them in their darkest hour simply because you cannot listen to them vent for 3 hours. The extinction burst is a terrifying storm to weather because it utilizes every single trigger that originally built your trauma response. You must hold your ground and recognize this escalation for what it is, proof that your boundaries are actually working. As you stand firm amidst this chaotic pushback, you're going to be hit by a tidal wave of internal guilt. For the recovering people-pleaser, guilt feels identical to the sensation of doing something morally reprehensible. But you must radically rewire your understanding of what this specific guilt actually represents. The guilt you feel when setting a boundary is not a signal that you have committed a sin against another human being. It is simply a withdrawal symptom from a lifelong addiction to external approval. Just like a physical body detoxing from a chemical dependency, your nervous system is going to scream for its familiar fix. Your brain is wired to associate displeasure from others with mortal danger, so it floods your body with cortisol to force you back into submission. You have to learn to sit with this intense emotional discomfort without immediately rushing to fix it. Tolerating the guilt of disappointing someone is the absolute prerequisite for psychological freedom. If you cannot stomach the feeling of being temporarily the bad guy in someone else's story, you will remain a hostage forever. Think of this phase of individuation as a snake violently shedding its skin. The process is not a gentle, elegant transformation. It is a blind, painful, and deeply uncomfortable struggle. The snake must literally scrape itself against sharp rocks to tear away the dead layers that are restricting its growth. When you peel off the good boy or sweet girl persona, it feels like you are tearing away your actual flesh. But if you do not endure the friction of this shedding process, the old skin will eventually suffocate you. Beneath the anxiety and the guilt lies an even deeper, more profound emotion: grief. Individuation is a death process just as much as it is a rebirth. You have to actively mourn the death of the idealized, perfectly accommodating version of yourself that you spent decades building. You're also grieving the fantasy that if you were just good enough, you could permanently secure everyone's love and prevent all conflict. Giving up that illusion of control requires a period of genuine, intense mourning. This grief extends to the very real losses you will experience in your social ecosystem. As you integrate your shadow and refuse to be a dumping ground for other people's dysfunction, your relationships will fundamentally alter. Some connections will successfully renegotiate the terms and emerge stronger, anchored in mutual respect rather than covert dependency. But others will shatter completely, unable to survive the introduction of your authentic boundaries. You must accept the brutal reality that some people only loved the mask you wore, and they will leave when the mask comes off. There is a profound loneliness inherent in this stage of the journey. You may find yourself standing like a lone figure, walking away from a crowded, noisy room that suddenly feels entirely alien. The friends who only called when they needed a favor will slowly stop calling. The family dynamics that relied on your silent martyrdom will become incredibly strained and distant. This isolation is not a punishment for setting boundaries. It is the necessary clearing of the brush to make way for new growth. Do not rush to fill this new, empty space with more relationships built on the old, transactional model. Let the silence echo for a while. The people who fall away during your individuation process are the exact weights that were keeping you submerged in the first place. Their departure is the ultimate confirmation that your energetic signature has fundamentally shifted. You are no longer broadcasting the frequency of a victim, which means parasites can no longer attach to you. You are facing a stark, binary choice. You can either be liked by everyone, or you can be known by yourself. You cannot have both. The fallout of individuation is the price of admission to a life of actual substance. When you finally stop betraying yourself to manage the emotional weather of the people around you, you reclaim the steering wheel of your own destiny. The temporary pain of disappointing others is infinitely lighter than the chronic, soul-crushing agony of abandoning yourself. To survive this turbulent transition, your conscious mind needs a psychological anchor. Your homework for this stage of the journey is to create a personal boundary mantra. This is a short, definitive phrase you will silently repeat to yourself the moment the extinction burst hits and the guilt threatens to drown you. Write down something like, "Disappointing them is better than betraying myself," or "My peace is not up for negotiation." Memorize this mantra, weaponize it against your own nervous system's panic, and prepare to stand unshaken in the wreckage of your old life. You are standing in the wreckage of your old life, gripping your boundary mantra like a lifeline. But simply defending yourself against external attacks is an exhausting way to live if your internal house is still structurally unsound. To move from merely surviving the fallout to actually generating unshakable self-worth, we must descend one layer deeper into the Jungian psyche. Beyond the persona and beneath the shadow lies the foundational architecture of your life force, the anima and the animus. These are the inner feminine and inner masculine energies that govern how you interact with yourself and the world. It is absolutely critical to understand that in Jungian psychology, masculine and feminine energies have nothing to do with biological sex or modern gender roles. They are universal, archetypal forces that exist within every single human being, much like the opposing poles of a magnet. The feminine energy, or anima, is the archetype of receptivity, emotion, flow, intuition, and deep connection. The masculine energy, or animus, is the archetype of structure, logic, assertion, penetration, and boundary making. A psychologically whole individual possesses a dynamic, equal partnership between these two forces. The chronic people pleaser, however, suffers from a catastrophic energetic imbalance that dictates their entire personality. In your desperate childhood attempt to remain safe and non-threatening, you heavily over-indexed on the feminine archetype while actively crushing the masculine. But because you isolated this feminine energy, it did not develop into healthy receptivity or deep intuition. Instead, it mutated into a highly distorted, pathological version of itself. You became incredibly porous, absorbing the emotional weather of everyone around you because you lacked the structural walls to keep it out. In this distorted feminine state, your natural empathy degrades into emotional spongehood, where you literally cannot distinguish someone else's pain from your own. Your capacity to yield and compromise morphs into total passivity, leaving you paralyzed when a firm decision needs to be made. You wait for the world to happen to you, hoping that if you are just soft and accommodating enough, the world will treat you gently. But the world does not respect softness that lacks structure. It simply consumes it. This is why you feel constantly drained and fundamentally unsafe in your own body. To understand why you feel so profoundly unsafe, look at the energy you completely starved, your inner masculine. The healthy animus is the psychological architect and the internal warrior of the human mind. It is the energy that says, this is the logical reality of the situation, this is the plan, and this is the line no one is allowed to cross. By repressing this assertive energy to appear endlessly agreeable, you voluntarily demolished your own internal fortress. You left your soft, vulnerable feminine energy sitting, completely exposed in an open field, totally unprotected from predators. Because you have no internal masculine energy to protect you, you're forced to desperately seek that protection from the external world. You subconsciously try to manipulate other people into playing the role of your animus through acts of extreme service. You over-accommodate your partner, your boss, or your friends, secretly hoping that, in exchange, they will provide the structure, safety, and validation you cannot give yourself. But outsourcing your psychological safety is a fatal error. It guarantees that you will remain a perpetual dependent, terrified of abandonment, because losing them means losing your only source of protection. The ultimate cure for this profound vulnerability is what Carl Jung called the conjunctio, or the sacred inner marriage. You must stop looking for an external savior to validate your worth and begin actively cultivating your own inner masculine. You have to resurrect the internal warrior and command him to stand guard at the gate of your own heart. When your animus is strong enough to logically assess threats, set firm boundaries, and take decisive action, your anima finally feels safe enough to relax. Imagine your psyche as a beautiful, thriving garden. This is your anima, full of life, creativity, and deep emotional resonance. Your animus is the impenetrable stone wall built around that garden, complete with a heavy iron gate and a vigilant guard. Because the wall is absolute, the garden no longer has to worry about being trampled by careless intruders or exploited by thieves. The inner feminine can finally express its true, brilliant nature without fear, because the inner masculine is handling the perimeter. This internal alliance is the absolute bedrock of unshakable self-worth. When you achieve this inner marriage, your entire relationship with empathy completely transforms. You realize that true compassion without a rigid spine is just codependency disguised as virtue. A whole person can sit with a grieving friend, offering profound, nurturing presence without taking on a single ounce of their friend's actual pain. You can be deeply understanding of a partner's difficult past while simultaneously refusing to tolerate their abusive behavior in the present. You become a walking paradox to the unintegrated world, deeply empathetic, yet entirely unmess-with-able. This integrated state completely eradicates the fawn response at a biological level. When your internal masculine is actively validating your worth and protecting your energy, you no longer need the room to like you to feel safe. You can walk into a tense meeting, a difficult family gathering, or a high-stakes negotiation with a perfectly regulated nervous system. If someone misunderstands you, criticizes you, or withdraws their approval, your inner masculine steps up and says, "We do not need their permission to exist. We are fine." The frantic, chameleon-like shape-shifting simply ceases to happen because the survival threat has been neutralized. To begin building this inner marriage, you must learn how to diagnose your own energetic deficits in real time. Under periods of extreme stress, the psyche will always default to its most imbalanced state, clearly revealing which energy is currently starving. When a crisis hits or a conflict arises, you need to observe your immediate, automatic reaction. Do you dissolve into an anxious puddle, frantically trying to appease everyone, losing all sense of logic and structure? Or do you become ice cold, rigidly intellectualizing the problem and completely cutting off your emotional compassion? Your homework for this critical stage of the journey is to conduct a ruthless self-assessment of your stress response. Over the next week, every time you feel overwhelmed or triggered, I want you to ask yourself, am I suffering from an animus deficit or an anima deficit right now? If you are lacking boundaries, structure, and the ability to say no, your inner masculine needs immediate reinforcement. If you are lacking self-compassion, grace, and emotional fluidity, your inner feminine is crying out for attention. Identify the missing energy, deliberately invite it into the room, and begin the lifelong work of marrying the two halves of your soul. Once you begin actively balancing these inner forces, a profound silence falls over your previously chaotic mind. The exhausting, invisible war between who you actually are and who you pretend to be finally comes to an end. You are no longer a fractured entity, desperately managing a pristine persona while wrestling a feral shadow in the dark. You have stepped into the ultimate psychological culmination of this entire journey, the integrated self. This is the moment you stop merely surviving your life and finally begin to inhabit it. Living as an individuated human being does not mean you are suddenly perfect, enlightened, or devoid of negative emotions. It simply means you are whole, and wholeness is infinitely more powerful than the illusion of perfection. When you are whole, your outward actions are in complete, unshakable alignment with your internal reality. You smile only when you are genuinely amused. You agree only when you actually consent, and you give only when your cup is overflowing. The crushing cognitive dissonance that used to define your every waking moment completely evaporates. The most immediate, physical shock of this integration is the sheer volume of energy that suddenly returns to your body. For years, you've been spending up to 80% of your daily psychological bandwidth actively suppressing your shadow and maintaining your persona. Imagine driving down the highway with the emergency brake pulled all the way up, wondering why the engine is smoking and the car is barely moving. When you finally release that brake, the surge of available horsepower is absolutely breathtaking. This reclaimed life force inevitably triggers a massive explosion of physical vitality and untapped creative potential. People pleasers frequently struggle with chronic brain fog, a lack of passion, and a deep sense of aimlessness regarding their life's purpose. But purpose cannot exist in a vacuum of authenticity. It requires the exact vital energy you locked away in the basement. As your unacknowledged traits are integrated, you will suddenly find yourself picking up abandoned hobbies, pursuing dormant career ambitions, and speaking with a newfound magnetic authority. You are no longer using your creativity to engineer a flawless, agreeable mask for others. Instead, you are using it to build a life that actually belongs to you. As your energy shifts, The fundamental nature of your relationships must undergo a radical transformation. The hardest truth of chronic fawning is that a deeply entrenched people-pleaser has never actually experienced unconditional love. If you only allow people to see a highly curated, heavily filtered version of yourself, then they can only love the mask. Every relationship you built from within the fawn response was not a genuine connection. It was a covert transaction of appeasement. You were trading your authenticity for the temporary illusion of emotional safety. True, profound intimacy is mathematically impossible without the presence of your shadow and your boundaries. You cannot be deeply loved if you are not deeply known, and you cannot be known if you refuse to show your sharp edges. When you finally present your integrated self to the world, flaws, opinions, anger, and all, you give people the opportunity to love the real you. The people who stay, the ones who celebrate your newfound spine and respect your embodied no, are your true tribe. For the first time in your life, you will experience the breathtaking relief of being loved not for what you provide, but for who you inherently are. Of course, living authentically guarantees that you will inevitably be disliked, misunderstood, and judged by certain people. The integrated self accepts this reality not as a failure, but as an absolute necessity of navigating the human experience. You realize that someone else's disappointment in your boundaries is entirely their psychological responsibility to manage, not yours. You trade the exhausting pursuit of universal likability for the quiet, unshakable bedrock of self-respect. You finally understand that being the villain in a toxic person's story is a badge of absolute honor. It is crucial to understand that individuation is not a final destination where you arrive, unpack your bags, and never struggle again. It is a lifelong compass heading, a daily commitment to choosing authenticity over the familiar, seductive comfort of compliance. There will still be days when the ancient fawn response flares up, and the urge to swallow your voice feels overwhelmingly powerful. You will inevitably stumble, accidentally over-accommodate, and briefly slip the old mask back on during moments of high stress. The difference is that you now possess the psychological map to immediately recognize where you are and correct your course. Look back at the immense distance you have traveled since the beginning of this deep dive. You started as an exhausted, fractured fauna, trapped in a cage of your own making, completely alienated from your own soul. You bravely faced the terrifying reality of your persona, walked down into the dark basement of your psyche, and shook hands with your shadow. You reclaimed your stolen aggression, forged the sword of your boundaries, and built a sanctuary of safety through your inner marriage. You have done the harrowing, unglamorous work of picking up your shattered pieces and painstakingly gluing them back together. In traditional Japanese art, there is a beautiful practice called kintsugi, where broken pottery is repaired using lacquer mixed with powdered gold. The philosophy behind kintsugi dictates that the breaks and repairs are not something to disguise, but rather a vital part of the object's history. An integrated human being is a living, breathing piece of kintsugi art. Your wholeness is not defined by a flawless, unbroken surface, but by the golden seams of your retrieved darkness and healed trauma. You are infinitely more valuable, resilient, and beautiful because you have been broken and intentionally put yourself back together. Your final piece of homework for this series is to officially declare your independence from the fawn response. I want you to open your journal one last time and write a manifesto of the integrated self. Write down exactly who you are when you are no longer afraid of displeasing the world. Outline the boundaries that are no longer up for negotiation and list the dark, sharp, and powerful traits you now proudly claim as your own. Read this manifesto out loud to yourself every single morning as a reminder of the sovereign territory you have reclaimed. The journey out of the fawn response and into your authentic power is the most important psychological expedition you will ever undertake. You deserve a life where you are the author of your own story, not a supporting character in everyone else's. If this deep dive into Jungian individuation has helped you shatter your people-pleasing mask and reclaim your inner strength, please subscribe to the channel. Like this video, share it with someone who is actively struggling to find their own voice, and leave a comment below with one boundary from your new manifesto. Welcome to the authentic life. It is an absolute honor to finally meet the real you.